Hi, Professor Chomsky. So one of the questions that I had that was lingering is that these systems of global capital and state power seem to be what Zizek terms as something like systemic violence, that they're so invisible and they're so ingrained that we count them as sort of normal. And one of the points that I was wondering is whether you think some forms of humanitarian aid, such as like the Davos Corporation or like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, do they do you think that their sort of approach to humanitarianism, their sort of approach to international development, things like the IMF, contribute to sort of maintaining the status quo? And if so, if is it in some sort of disguised or sinister way of maintaining the status quo?
I don't think there's much that's disguised, frankly. It's
Yeah.
pretty open and penetrable. I mean, there are ideas about, they meet at Bilderberg and do all these things and so on. But the record shows that it's mostly pretty open. Now, there are things that go on in secret, but we know they're going on in secret. So, for example, take the current negotiations that I mentioned over the Trans-Pacific Transatlantic Partnership. These are huge treaties. They'll have a big effect on people's lives, and they are being negotiated in secret. The U.S. administration insists on what's called fast track. Previous administrations like Clinton did the same thing. What's fast track? Fast track means that we should be like Stalinist Russia. That is, the executive should make some huge decision, and then Congress should be allowed to say yes or no, no discussion. That's fast track. Now, that's what they're insisting on. There's some protest in Congress now. There could be more. Now, as I said, these negotiations are not entirely in secret. They are not secret to the army of corporate lawyers and lobbyists who are writing the agreements. They know all about it. And in fact, it's not even totally secret to us. Thanks to WikiLeaks, one part actually came out. It was the part on what's called intellectual property. Intellectual property means, it's a fancy term that means monopoly pricing rights. The reason why pharmaceuticals are so expensive, drugs, is because they have exorbitant patent rights way beyond anything in history that enable them to essentially charge monopoly prices, pretty close to it. So we pay huge amounts for drugs, and people who are in need can't access generic drugs at a fraction of the cost, terrible cost. That was the part that was released. It's not just pharmaceuticals, but others. And yes, it's highly protectionist, radically opposed to free trade, different from anything in history. U.S. would never have developed if it had had to adhere to such laws. And we can be pretty sure that the rest of it is like that too. So yes, things happen in secret, but we know that they're happening in secret, and it's up to us whether they do. If you look through the huge, this is a very free country by comparative standards, more than any other that I know. We have a huge record of declassified documents, secret documents that were then declassified, some essentially stolen, like the Pentagon Papers, classified but released. If you go through those, you find that there's very little related to national security in any serious sense. Overwhelmingly, it's protection of the state from its own citizens and protection of the corporate sector, like the Trans-Pacific Transatlantic treaties. So this is happening. There are things going on in secret, but they are penetrable. And most of what appears finally is released in the secret record. If you were paying attention, you pretty much knew about it anyway. So I don't really think it's all that invisible. The neoliberal programs that have been very harmful to much of the world, including us, they're all open if you want to look at them. For example, this IMF report that I quoted on the rather spectacular fact, that the profits of the big banks depend almost entirely on your willingness to pay them when they get into trouble. That's public. It was not a big headline in the newspapers, but you can read it in the business press. You can read the actual report. That goes back to the IMF. For a long time, the IMF was indeed part of the system of imposing a certain type of status quo in the interests of the investor community, primarily in the U.S., but elsewhere too. Economists sometimes call it the IMF, World Bank, Treasury Department triumvirate. That's what they were part of. It's interesting that that's beginning to change. In the last couple of years, IMF researchers have come out with a number of papers that are quite critical of the establishment programs. The one I just cited is one of them. Another, which is quite important, had to do with the austerity programs that are being imposed in Europe. Europe is more regressive than we are in this respect, believe it or not. The Fed looks pretty progressive as compared with the European Central Bank. So austerity programs are being imposed on much of Europe. It's undermining and may destroy the welfare state, which was Europe's great achievement in the late 20th century, in the interests of bankers and investors and so on. The IMF came out with a study highly critical of this, running through hundreds of historical examples and showing that imposing austerity under recession is extremely harmful to the economy. Well, it didn't have much of an impact, but at least they're doing it. And it might change. The World Bank is another case in point. The new president of the World Bank is a very impressive person, actually an old friend, but a person who's been actively engaged in very significant work in health programs in the third world and other things like that, Jim Kim. That's beginning to change the character of the bank. A lot of this is happening under public pressure, various kinds of public pressure, which can have effect on the major institutions. They're not immune.
Thank you.